So now we're moving to our last presentation of this morning. I already introduced Elliott the other day. So without further ado, we're moving now to a very important part, which is the link between the things we've been studying over the last couple of days and links with religiosity, spirituality. So without further ado, Elliott, I'm looking forward to your talk.
All right, thank you, everybody. So, let's see. One thing, while it's on my mind, I like the Blade Runner example. When I went to see Blade Runner 2049, afterwards, later that day, I went to the grocery store, and in the refrigerated meats section, there was a drone like a, and it took me right back to the movie, and it was kind of a non-ordinary experience. It was very much the vibe of the soundtrack. So a couple things about the talk. There were some, within the past week, a few shifts in the focus of some of our, let's see, I don't know the language of these menus here. Could someone help me figure out how to put this on? So I have a little less time than initially planned, so I will try to move pretty quickly. And Anne covered some of the religion, spirituality stuff, so I can definitely answer questions about that. I'm going to tie some of the validation stuff to some practical applications we're working on now, and two of the areas I'll go into are sensed presences, which is the topic of one of the grants that we're currently working on, and mysticism, which has become a pet issue for me after looking into how they validated the MEQ. So this is a question I've been asked many times. I assume there's a version of this that you all have gotten here as well. How many of you would be likely, 4 or 5 on this scale, to recommend Windows to people? Some people, okay. And of those, how many people have ever recommended Windows to anyone in their life? Okay, we've got one. All right, so there's some, and that's another point, because there's some people for whom this is like, well, where this came from was a Reddit post like 10 years ago. I need you to understand people don't have conversations where they randomly recommend operating systems to one another. But of course, some people do, and so you have two different populations who might be interpreting this in very different ways. I wrestle with this when I see, do they want to know how much I like it, or do they want to know if I ever recommend operating systems? Unfortunately, most survey validation does not give this type doesn't seek this type of feedback. If I turn on presenter view, will that just show it to me? Okay. What's that in Portuguese? Is that any of these? Do we have a present? Can I get a little help here with that? I could be fine without it probably, but to continue here. So we've been talking about the response process today, which is one of the sources of validity evidence mentioned in the standards, which is something I had to go to the education department to learn about this, but kind of a manual for how to validate things with the categories of evidence. And typically people focus on the quantitative evidence, as we've been discussing. Response process being the cognitive processes participants use when they respond to a survey item, why they pick a response, etc. And quick review we'll zip through for time purposes. Response process evaluation, if you leave my talk here with anything, it's a way to rapidly get data on this underutilized source of validation evidence from your specific target population, however you're going to recruit your participants. You can do it that way. Revise the item, get rid of the low-hanging fruit misinterpretations that you didn't think of as the researcher, and then document that for other people. And this, of course, is not alone sufficient for all purposes, and I have nothing in principle against quantitative methods, so these can be used together. If you supplement a factor analysis with this type of thing, I think that makes it a lot more robust. So all of these things are harmonious together. So factor analysis, we group items together based on how they vary, and it assumes that there's some variable that is causing all this variation, and then researchers get to put their label on the underlying variables with varying levels of correctness. But depression, classic example, that might be the reason why the scores vary in the model. Now, this is a factor analysis of the mystical experience questionnaire out of Johns Hopkins, McLean et al. And here we've got 4 sets of items about mystical experiences. There used to be many more sets, but hey, they loaded on the same factor, so they're probably all measuring the same thing, right? They load on these 4 factors, and so based on this, with little in the way of theoretical arguments or even definitions, we conclude that this is measuring 4 aspects of mystical experience as defined by Walter Stace. Or can we trust that conclusion? Well, as we saw before, we can get these 2 subscales of GAVA-GUI to load on 2 factors, even though they mean nothing at all. So clearly, there is some reason to be skeptical of these quantitative methods alone. And this is usually the primary test for survey validation, at least in the world of psychology, as other areas where it's more sophisticated. But what's called, so a construct is your concept, the thing you're trying to measure, and construct irrelevant variance is any variance that's not being caused by that construct. And so in that factor analysis, all of the variance was construct irrelevant because there was no construct at all. And there's a emerging literature on how surface level differences and semantic features of the items, you can predict the vast majority of variation in survey scores just by feeding it into a semantic prediction algorithm. And if you can predict the correlations and the mediation relationships between your variables before you give them to any participants, maybe that says something good about semantic analysis, and also maybe it's a little scary about how well we can trust our questionnaires. So these methods can be misleading, and just having a factor structure, it's great for talking about reliability and quantitative patterns, but it's not strong evidence about what a scale measures, despite what you may read in Yaden and Newberg's book. And also, the factor analysis is going to look the same no matter what you're claiming it measures. It's going to be equally good evidence whether you claim it measures one thing or another, even if it's measuring nothing at all. But we can label these latent variables more confidently with these methods we've been discussing. So, all right, on to the new stuff. So, as we talked about cognitive interviews, focus groups, that's a standard way to get evidence of the response process. And we did a little pilot study. We were submitting to Advances in Methods in Psychological Science, AMPS journal, and they suggested, hey, this is cool, but why don't you compare which of these, the strengths of RPE compared to other methods? So we did that, and we found, well, first of all, hopefully, obviously, it's way faster to do this stuff online. And when we quantified it and we actually went through with the same items, cognitive interviews and response process evaluation, took us about 27 hours to do the data collection for the cognitive interviews, especially when we take into account the no-shows for the interviews. But 30 minutes of researcher time was all it took to do a number of iterations with some of our items from the inventory. So much faster and cheaper, given the amount of time it takes for participants and things like that. So this is going to be coming out in our preprint here. We'll have a newer version soon, and that's on the verge of being published in AMPS there. And so as far as the results, so okay, faster, cheaper, but that's not always better. But we found that they were pretty comparable. So as far as the number of people we judged as understanding an item or not understanding an item, pretty similar. You can see maybe a little more uncertainty in RPE method, as well as in the next slide. We got some responses that were too short to evaluate, but as far as the themes that were coming out across the different methods, not to mention the variability we'd already expect with the participants, but we end up finding very similar patterns with both methods. And as far as the response quality, very comparable. There was a slight, a non-significant, but it seems like probably likely a real thing, that with the cognitive interviews, we were able to get somewhat higher responses, where there were fewer cases where we wanted to ask follow-up questions, but not by much. It was very comparable. And we ended up drawing pretty much the same conclusions from both methods. They identified the same problems, led to the similar suggestions for revising the item, and so worked comparably, but much more efficiently, about 54 times faster in terms of the data collection. So just a little advertisement there, I guess, for response process. And this isn't just about measurement. So people tend to think, I think as a result of the operationalism kind of, I don't think the physics people even latched onto that as much as the psych people, as far as, well, what is something? It boils down to however you're measuring it. Or the way we operationalize a variable can kind of stand in for theory. And so I think as a result of that, a lot of people have not cared so much about developing the theory because, hey, we can hand wave a little bit, okay, do a vague definition of something, make up some items that we never run by participants, and then, but quantitative results, so we're measuring whatever we claim, even if we don't have a good definition. So, but measurement is a really key part of it ties into theory much more than people tend to appreciate. And when you think through how are participants going to interpret this item, what do we want them to think it means, that can force researchers to get clearer in their own minds about what they're looking at, and as a result, move forward the theory, not just a methodological technique. And by doing so, this helps researchers get on the same page and use their terms in similar ways. As I'll go into with the sensed presence literature, there's a lot of people who define similar terms, even sometimes when they have the exact same explicit one-sentence definition of what a sensed presence is, they'll measure it in completely different ways. And so if they think more and document more about the response process, there will be less of that. Researchers themselves will be able to be more confident that they're talking about the same phenomena and not creating a literature that's all ostensibly about one topic, but everybody's measuring something a little different and then trying to integrate it, which is difficult. So documenting how items are interpreted helps with this and can help researchers when they're looking for a measure. A lot of measures, you use a recycled measure, somebody, okay, it's in the title, here's a measure of awe or whatever, and without, because it's labeled that way, we'll use the scale. But with this sort of documentation, it's easier to make sure that your scale is really measuring what you want to be studying. And so, one question that I had in exploring this literature was, have people looked at this with respect to non-ordinary experiences? And one of the big ones, really important even in the clinical world today, is the mystical experience questionnaire, which is put forward in a lot of, especially the papers out of Hopkins, as the mechanism by which psychedelics improve health, cause lasting changes in personality, etc. So I started digging into that. And there's a long history of single questions used to measure mystical experiences. One of them comes from Greeley, and this is his question. Have you ever had the feeling of being close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself? And in this study, this has been used in loads of surveys over the years, and over time, it'll change over history, but in general, between 20 and 40% of people will say yes to this question. Now, there's a study, which is, I think, the first in this kind of tradition. Thomas and Cooper they basically did some response process evaluation type thing, and they got people to answer this question, and whether they said yes or no, they asked them to describe their experience in more detail, and they compared this to some of the classic descriptions of mystical experience. And these are pretty much in line with Walter Stace's, which is the one that the MEQ is based on. And that's usually substantiated by just citing Stace without much elaboration. What they found is 34 participants in this study said yes to this question, I've had this experience. But only 2% were judged as having this mystical experience as described in, and what's a mystical experience? There's some debate, but as far as the Common Core, there's a large degree of consensus, for better or worse, around that. And, for all the debates about what is it and should we think in different terms, it's a really widely used concept that's leaned on very forcefully in the psychedelic literature, so it's certainly worthy of discussing whether people meet the standards that they say they have for what this experience is. So that's not super promising. Here are the types of experiences that they had. So 66%, these were the people who didn't say yes. They did not talk about a mystical type experience. 8% are what we call the 3 codes, not enough information. 2% had mystical, and this is even probably on the liberal side as far as including a lot of stuff compared to, say, what Stace talks about. This is Walter Stace in his Mysticism and Philosophy book, 1960-61. Expression of awesome emotions, a sense of the ineffable, feeling of oneness with God, nature, or the universe, and maybe a noetic quality, a sense of learning something new about the universe. Other people talked about psychic experiences, ESP and things like that. Stace and others are quite definitive. This isn't, it's great you can talk to a spiritual entity and get some information, but mystical experiences about this oneness and just directly perceiving that everything is one thing, whether you do that through experiencing pure consciousness or through the senses. And then some other religious and spiritual traditions. And so also there's so the Hardy question is another one that was given very widely as part of Hardy's big survey. Pretty similar. Have you ever been aware or influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not? So a little bit of generic wording there, which is nice, which is different from your everyday self. And this also, to Hardy's surprise, elicited a wide range of responses, and a lot of them were not mystical. For example, 28% of the people who said yes to this were, talking to a dead relative or something like that. And so it's a great experience for people to have, nothing wrong with that, but it's not the mystical experience that people say that they're measuring. And so reflecting on this particular study and reviewing a few more of these studies, Hood et al., and this would be the Ralph Hood of the Mysticism scale, this is in their text book. I forget the title of it, but they have a chapter on mysticism, chapter 11, I think. Probably a coincidence that it's called that. Although the bankruptcy, there's potential for a pun in there. Conceptually bankrupt. Chapter 11 is what we call it in U.S. So what they write here is, once again, it is evident that persons who were responding to particular questions were in fact reporting a wide range and type of experiences. This was true even though the specific wording of the Hardy appeal used in this study was field-tested and assumed to draw out both the mystical and numinous qualities of religious experience. And in this book, in this chapter in particular, I was really encouraged to see them reflecting on this in this way, although for some reason their skepticism vanishes completely when it comes to multi-item surveys, presumably just because no one's collected evidence on it and nobody's thought to worry about it. But I don't see why these same concerns wouldn't apply to something that's been through factor analysis, for example. And now maybe you're thinking, okay, have you ever been aware, presence or power, God or not, different from everyday self? This is really broad. Why would this? I'm not convinced that this means you can't measure mystical experience. This just seems like a really bad question. And if that's what you're thinking, I agree, which is why I was surprised to see the evidence of construct validity presented by McLean and colleagues for the mystical experience questionnaire. So they used what they call a mystical experience probe. It's another one of these single questions. These are all reviewed in that Hood, Hill, and Spilka textbook chapter. And so the question they used, they added just the psilocybin thing. And so here was their benchmark for mystical experience, which they claimed was their evidence of the construct validity of the MEQ. They ask, during a psilocybin session, would you say that you have ever had a spiritual or mystical experience, that is a moment of sudden awakening or spiritual insight? So is this a good way is this what we should say? Well, as long as they said yes to this, if the mystical experience questionnaire gives them a high score, that gives us a lot of confidence that it's really measuring mystical experiences. And so now here we rely on spiritual or mystical experience. We're relying on participants to interpret this. And that is nothing wrong with that in principle. But when you're trying to measure something, this is a theme that has come up over and over, and I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're writing items. So when you're trying to measure a certain type of experience, or when you're thinking about mystical experience or religious experience or whatever, there's kind of two ways you can approach it. One way, perfectly valid, is to just see what participants mean when they use the word mystical and see what the range of experience is. That's like what we did with our religious and spiritual appraisals. We wanted to see if they use the word, and then we document all the different ways, and we don't assume two participants use that word in exactly the same way, which is great if you're interested in how do people use terms like this. But if you want to measure a specific experience, then it's really important to get clear about the experience and make sure participants are as well, and choose a definition of your experience that, that you're confident all the participants agree on, which might not be the way they would interpret the word mystical. So we really have to decide, do we want to know what people mean by mystical, or do we have an idea? Do we have a definition of mystical experience, which of course the mystical experience questionnaire is based on a specific definition. So it's really important to get clear about what you're trying to measure. And if you look for this fork in the road, you'll see it in a lot of places. And when you try to develop items, it's important to keep in mind, do I want to know how they're going to interpret the word, or do I have something specific I want to be measuring? So, and just to illustrate potential downsides of going the left path when you're really wanting to measure something specific, we just asked, hey, so in some preliminary stuff looking at the MEQ, we asked participants if there was anything mystical about their experience. And among the people who told us there was, we got some things that were like straight out of Walter Stace. The vividness of my perceptions, the profound insights, and the overwhelming sense of unity. So that's close. A little more detail would be good, but that's right on the money. That's totally consistent with the way mystical experience is defined in the MEQ. And as Stace says, this quote is representative of what he writes. Although, if you're interested in mystical experience, I think it should be a crime to be studying mystical experience or doing anything with the MEQ if you haven't read. You don't even have to read Stace's whole book, but there's sections 5 through 8 in chapter 2 go through the characteristics, and you may be surprised to see how much they differ from some of the reports. But so this kind of sums up the key parts of Stace. He takes from Wittgenstein a little bit, and he's like, well, we can't give a specific definition. It's kind of a family resemblance thing, but the core that has to be present in any experience says, in this general experience of a unity which the mystic believes to be, in some sense, ultimate and basic to the world, we have the very inner essence of all mystical experience. So this person gets it. The unity, wow, all is one, and this is a deep truth about the universe. That's what the mystical experience is all about, according to Stace. Another one that was good, that fit where the researcher's definition and the participant's definition were in alignment. I felt like I was part of something much larger, a collective energy or consciousness that was full of love and understanding. So that's great. If everybody said that when you asked them if they had a mystical experience, there would be no problem. We never would have developed the RPE method. I would be in industry instead. But we also got people saying, well, what was mystical about your experience? Well, everyone was purple. We were camping and we had a fire. It felt like all the fire was coming from inside the earth. That's awesome. I would love to have that experience. But Walter Stace would say, no. He's very picky if you read the book. And yet no one has it's crazy to me that everyone just cites Stace. The theory on this has not developed at all, and people have just stopped bothering to put a definition in when they're validating a questionnaire. It's unbelievable. So you end up getting things like this. I went to my tent to grab my headlamp, and in the dark started to see lights. These lights kind of gathered into a mosaic, and a fox appeared. It felt like a visitation. Again, very cool. But Stace, who we claim to base this on, says, no, visionary experiences do not count as mystical. It has to be the unity. The sky felt kind of shimmery or glossy at times. Pretty great. Not mystical. I felt at peace. And if you want to call this mystical, too, that's fine. I'm just trying to help these people with the MEQ be consistent with what they're claiming. But yeah, peace can be mystical, sure, but that's the left fork in the road. I felt at peace. Great. But this is what people have in mind when you ask if they had a mystical experience, at least these people. Yeah, I was hallucinating. That's mystical. All right. So yeah, no surprise you get a high level of mystical experience even with all types of psychedelics. So once we do have a definition, though, if we decide to take the right fork, measure something specific, then we can apply the RPE method, and we can see if participants can get on the same page with our definition. But this is very hard to state a definition, and when you try to do it, it really shows you how much theoretical, conceptual work you have to do to be doing something coherent, and it opens up a lot of empirical work. Hey, there's a lot of times you have to go back to the drawing board and collect some more data to figure out, what do I really want to focus on here? What is most associated with the outcomes that I care about? It has forced us to think more deeply about the theory than we would have had we not been trying to validate these items. So that brings us to presence experiences, the topic of our current work. And so a lot of people talk about feeling a presence. They're not physically there, but I feel like they're there. Maybe I hallucinate them visually. Maybe I just have a sense of it. Maybe I feel their hand on my shoulder. And so these can be sensory or not. There can be sensory cues, or they could be no sensory cues. Just I know someone's here. I can tell. I even maybe know where they are, but I can't see them or hear them. And these are pretty common in psychiatric disorders, Parkinson's, schizophrenia, especially when there's more dementia involved, it seems, but also in the general population, depending how you measure these. When you look at people who are bereaved, who've lost a loved one, some of the studies are into more than half of people they report. There's some variation, but it's tough to find studies that do a thorough investigation of all these types of presence studies that don't get at least 20% of people, and often it's around 30 or so, or 40 reporting these. And so there's a lot of papers on this, but and they're super common, but despite how common they are, we don't know that much. There's some very interesting hypotheses about how they might occur, and there's so many different types. So there might be a whole lot of different mechanisms involved. So it's not, that surprising that we don't have a thorough understanding of it yet, even though a ton of people seem to report these. But one big obstacle to figuring out the mechanisms, either overall for presences or for specific types, is that there's a lot of, so two sides of a coin here. One is that there's many different labels, even for talking about the same type of experience. Part of this is a disciplinary thing, but even within similar subfields, there's this one paper that has this table of 25 different terms to refer to roughly the same experience of experiencing a dead loved one come back to you through the senses. And so here's like a few of these. I like the neologisms here I hadn't seen before: idiophony and idionecrophonies, which are fun words. But these are highly overlapping at the very least. And so there's a lot of different terms. We're not on the same page about what to call them. Such is science, especially psychology. But even when there is one label that's applied, people define it and operationalize it in different ways. So this, there's a kind of a fun term called the jingle fallacy, which I don't remember if Thorndike coined this term or if he talks about talking to some other professor who uses the term, but that's as far back as I could trace it. This is the idea that there are two different things that you put the same label on, and so you treat them as though they are the same. And the jangle fallacy is the opposite. That's about having many different types of terms for the same thing. This block paper is awesome. He takes down it's a master class in the pitfalls of factor analysis as applied to the 5-factor model. Worth reading for people interested in surveys. And so we got the Grinch covering up. I want to be the antidote to jingle, which of course the Grinch is the one who stops the jingling from happening. And so if we have clear definitions and we can capture them with precise instruments, then we don't need to be so worried about this. But why should we be worried about it? Well, felt presences And there's a little bit of jangling going on here too. There's a lot of different terms, but these are all, they all use virtually the same explicit definition. So felt presences, sensed presences, felt presence experiences, the feeling of a presence, these aren't all that different. But they're defined in this way. The basic feeling that someone else is present in the immediate environment without any other clear sensory evidence. And so this almost verbatim across a huge literature uses this, but what counts as clear sensory evidence? How do we, is this a precise enough definition? It seems pretty detailed. Aren't we done working by the time we have this sentence? Well, so Barnby himself has this paper, and he looks at a bunch of items. He's got a table, and he looks at survey items and says, well, we should really only be considering items that are unambiguous. They don't conflate the wording with other kinds of hallucination. We just want the felt presence with no sensory experience. I want to know they're there without seeing or hearing them. And so, for example, one of the examples he takes from the Durham Hypnagogic and Hypnopompic Hallucinations Questionnaire. I felt an evil presence in the room, but could not see, hear, touch, or smell anyone there. This is very unambiguous, and that's at this, so taking without any other clear sensory evidence to kind of one extreme. So and there's four items in this DHQ subscale. 3 of them are this thorough, 1 is slightly less thorough, but they really try to exclude any sensory things. And they say, so they count these and they label them felt presences. Pretty good. Until we look at another paper, they use the same term, almost the exact same definition. This is really recent. Ben Alderson-Day is on here. He and Barnby are probably the 2 biggest people in this particular area. And they say felt presence, also referred to as sensed presence, the experience of an external entity in the nearby environment without clear sensory evidence. But how do they measure it? They used items that were specifically about sensory hallucinations. 89% of the felt presences they're measuring came from this question about tactile hallucinations. Some people have experienced being touched by someone or feeling a hand on their shoulder while nobody was nearby. Contrast that with you couldn't feel or touch them from the DHQ. Another example is people having the feeling as if bugs are crawling under their skin, which could have nothing to do with the presence. And so this is most of their felt presences. And again, these are totally worth exploring these experiences. Also, visual hallucinations and some auditory hallucinations were also included. They didn't do us the favor of including the other items in the paper. You have to kind of track down references and guess what items they were using, which again makes it tricky to compare. So transparency. There's a great paper, Measurement Schmeasurement by Flake and Freed. I think they coined the term QMPs, questionable measurement practices, and they give a lot of recommendations, including just being thorough in documenting this type of thing. Worth reading. So, and again, these are fine. And even if you want to define, felt presence or another term in this way, I have no problem with that. But when we're trying to compare, and this could even, without clear sensory evidence, could be interpreted pretty liberally. Okay, if it's just a hand on your shoulder but you can't see them, sure, someone could argue that's not clear sensory evidence. But when we're using the exact same term and two papers on the exact same thing with the exact same explicit definition, one of them excludes all of this stuff and the other one only includes this stuff, we have a problem. It's going to be difficult to converge on an understanding of the phenomenon itself, let alone the mechanisms. So my goal is not to say one of these definitions is right. I think it's too early to do that because there's so much about this topic that's unexplored, we shouldn't aim for a super high level of precision yet necessarily. I think transparency. I just had this thought. I think I might start using this: transparency over precision. It's way more important to be clear about what you did than it is to have the exact correct definition that no one can differ with. So even if you're not sure, you're like, well, is it clear sensory evidence? Is it this or that? Doesn't really matter. What matters more is that you're very clear and explicit and document what you're doing. So what we tried to do was to make a measure that would capture that could be used by people with various definitions, and they could choose it based on this RPE style documentation. So regardless of whether you want to include visual, auditory cues, you can do that with these new items we've developed. And they're in the format of the inventory, but they could also be used independently. We have some experience items and some appraisal items. And so this is buffet style, it's modular, it's a la carte, sometimes a la mode. But this lets people choose which items they want to use. We don't have to say, well, if you're measuring mystical experience, you better be defining it in terms of states, and you better be happy with the way we've operationalized it. Of course, there are many advantages, as Ron knows well, to having a lot of items and the statistical things that you can do with them. We're focusing on one item because that would have been way too much to think about at the time. But anyway, so you can pick these items, the ones that work for you, and make some more. So our presence items we have here, don't need to belabor these. These are from the original inventory. We modified presence dead. There were some issues with India, there were some other issues, and so we did refine this one a bit, and we've been using that. And so we ask, yes, no, have you had these experiences? And then we have some follow-up items. One is just to double check there's an other, since, a non-ordinary presence could be a lot of things, or guided or influenced could mean a lot of things. We wanted to make sure they thought this was another being with them. I'll talk a little about each of these. And we were most focused on which sensory cues were involved in the experience, and some of the quality of those cues, whether you directly saw it or whether you saw a plant fall off the table, and when you were talking about going to visit a medium, and then you said, okay, well, that's a sign. That would be indirect versus seeing someone directly. And the quality. So I'll talk a little more about these. But again, whether you're interested in, I just want to know if it's visual or not. I just want to know if there was a tactile sensation or not. You can pick these. You don't have to do all the items. It takes forever to do the whole inventory. So we asked our presence items to a bunch of people in the United States, are 4 different groups: Catholics, non-denominational Christians, spiritual but not religious, and neither spiritual nor religious. And so we had about half of people say yes to at least one presence item. But as we saw a little in validation, people can vary on the margins of what they consider some of these terms to mean. And especially with some of our other items that people will talk about, kind of the vibe of a place, or there's an energy here, or actually a big one that we did a little better with than the experience items themselves, but feeling present. If you ask if someone's had a sense of presence, you're going to have a ton of people saying, oh, I was sitting on the beach and I was meditating and I felt really present. But that's, of course, not what we mean. So in order to just double check on that, we made an item to filter this out. And we've started to find with certain items, it's really hard to put in a single item what you want to measure. But if you ask a follow-up item, now this adds a whole other source of potential errors, which is complicated. But if you need another layer of filtering out an experience, that's a thing we've started doing more. So to give people a lot, this is a binary item in terms of the way we score it, but we give people a lot of options so everybody feels like they have a home for their presence. We ask them, well, so first of all, we're extra clear here, a lot of experimenting with forms of emphasis. If you've had this experience multiple times, just think of one time, because a lot of people will say it happens all the time. They'll check all 5 senses, and some people are referring to multiple experiences. Other people, all 5 senses happened at once. So we want to be really clear. We just want to know about one experience. And then we ask, was there really a presence? Was there some other that was present with you? Yep, physical being, a non-physical being with a body, a non-physical being without a body, universal force, energy, or power, or no. And we lump all the yeses together and say, yes, this is what we mean by presence. Yeah, and I will keep zipping through a little quick, but I'll try to leave a little room for questions if we want to go to this. There's some changes to the items that we made, which are probably not as relevant for this portion of the talk, but I'm happy to talk about the pitfalls and the things we had to tweak about these items, since we learned a lot from that. So appeared was a big one. A lot of people interpreted that visually. It appeared to be this or that. We changed to seemed, for example. So those are our typical RPE tweaks. And finally, we were able to put a confidence interval around some of these. And so we found this was quite well understood. Although most people said yes, so room for tightening that up. But once we did this presence filter, we found, especially with the guidance item, people were using the presence a little more loosely, and so we excluded some more. But here we have all the people who said yes is the whole bar, and then if they said yes to the presence filter, it's the dark purple, and the lavender gray color is no to the presence filter. So if they said presence dead, most people actually experienced an other being there. But for the guidance item, I felt guided by a non-ordinary power or force. Some people were not talking about an other being there, but almost. Our overall prevalence went down about 5% with the filter. So trying to be very specific about presences here. Even a quarter of our nuns had at least one of these presence experiences with an other being, which is good for them. And yeah, the guidance item was most likely to not really involve a presence. And we have with one of our appraisal items about context. So a lot of people studying these experiences will want to exclude dreams for potentially obvious reasons, or will want to include dreams, or maybe you only want to look at dreams, but we have this categorical item with all these categories. Were you asleep? Were you on drugs? Were you sober, normal state? Mental illness involved, and so you can see those. And well, I guess one of the takeaways here is that most of these did occur without any sleepiness, exhaustion, drugs, or anything. People are having these experiences of sound mind, normal waking states of consciousness. And again, this is you could include it. Maybe you don't care about this. Maybe you do care. Maybe you just want to know if it's a dream. But pick whatever food you want from the buffet table of the inventory. Then our most important item here is which senses were involved. This was also an adventure to try to code, and touch in particular was tricky. There's a lot of gray area about what counts. So we ended up, in the interest of consistency, we included any sort of skin sensation as being touched. Long story, we could go into that if you're interested in, but main points here is that we were happy with this item, and it's hard to make me happy about these things, so it was good. So we tried to make this pretty broad, which of the senses were involved in your experience of the presence. People generally understood, but there were some, so if they saw the presence, they picked vision. If there were no senses involved, they picked none. But if there were sort of multiple senses, like this person was like, oh my God, I knew someone was in my bed with me, they were right behind me, and they had this sort of the classic felt presence without any sensory cues, but then they looked and they saw an indentation in the bed as if someone had been there. They didn't pick vision, but the vision wasn't their primary thing, so that's the type of misunderstandings or inconsistencies we somehow got here that contributes to our not 100% here. Let's see, had an experience looking at a photo that just made my skin crawl and gave me an eerily bad feeling, but selected none because it wasn't visually seeing the presence, but it was the internal feeling that was the cue. Other people with similar experiences did pick vision, but this is a secondary cue. So most of the misunderstandings had to do with these secondary cues that weren't the primary way they detected the presence, according to them. So I think that's a good sign. They didn't miss any of these direct sensory cues. So we were happy with this item. And we can skip this. And let's see. So now, as far as when there's no sensory evidence, we got some interesting experiences of a few different types. And these we tried hard to validate, but I'll just throw these words on here first. So there are emotional experiences. Sitting in a church, a sense of peace, went from anxiety to calm, everything was going to be okay. So emotional things, but overlaps kind of with the internal sensations, a calming sensation inside, as if muscles tensed for a moment and then would relax. And so there's some emotions, some bodily stuff there. And then there's some intuitions, which also overlap here, spidey sense, or just it felt like there was something there. I couldn't put my finger on it. We weren't able to reliably delineate these types of things. So this is just all the kind of stuff that gets lumped in our none. No sensory cues category. And we have some other questions that are maybe less relevant for the talk here, but the kinds of distinctions that we were able to make, at least there's some fun anecdotes here we can start closing out with. So I saw what appeared to be a deceased friend. She looked like any other human on that bus, directly seeing someone who they thought, and they elaborate, and they thought this really was the person, but just looked like a person. So this is an example of directly seeing who they think the person is. I was visited via a spirit in a colorful, trendy outfit that happened to be my mom. So directly saw the colorful, trendy outfit. And then an indirect cue, I mentioned this, they were talking about, hey, should we go talk to a psychic about this? And then this plant flies off 2 feet away and crashes on the ground. And then they're like, okay, that's a sign that some presence is here with us. They didn't directly see it. So that's another distinction we wanted to make. Let's see, yeah, hand on my shoulder, direct sense of touch. Hairs on my skin stood up. That they didn't directly perceive the presence, but they felt a touch-related tactile sensation that led them to believe the presence was there. This is a distinction that, now, as we worked with some of these items, we found there were a lot of other distinctions we wanted to make, but, you can see there's potential utility for some people who care about whether it's like a direct visual hallucination versus seeing something and inferring that a presence is there. We thought that would be a good distinction to make. People understood this item quite well, although there were some marginal responses here. So the biggest disagreement was about, among participants and the research team, was about whether if your mother comes back as a bird, are you directly perceiving your mother, or is that indirect? And some people conceive of the bird as though it is their mother, it's reincarnation, and other people will say, well, she really liked birds, and so I knew she was here. And then some people are kind of in between, and so that was our biggest uncertainty. Is that direct? Is that indirect? But in general, people understood this. But those are the types of potential ambiguities that I think are important if you're going to use a scale to know are possible. So there we go. Let's see. All right, so we can move along here. We had direct and indirect sense of touch, blah, blah, blah. People had some of these. Let's see. So the sensory quality, this was kind of fun. And this was our longest response options we ever wrote. And this was the brainchild of Brian Scholl, a visual guy at Yale, who was really concerned with, well, there's a big difference between seeing something that looks like something you'd see every day and maybe interpreting it spiritually, versus having something that looks like you're tripping, like the guarana plant totally looks like something out of an acid trip with the eyeballs. And so, although I guess that would be ordinary, technically, if you're used to seeing that. But we wanted to see, well, were the visual qualities of the experience, God, this was hard to get people to understand, the same or different from usual vision. So even if we know the experience was unusual, don't say it was different just because it was a weird thing. We want to know if the visual qualities themselves were different. So anyway, we had a few things in terms of non-ordinary sensory quality that we pick up here. Something more tangible than just light. It was like light being filtered through water, glittering with rainbow coloring at the edges, shifting around the whole stage. And they go on to elaborate more of a kind of trippy experience there as a kid in church, and they had this kind of almost some kind of epileptic sounding phenomenon, or they end up saying, at the time I thought it was angels, but I just had low blood sugar, which of course can cause non-ordinary visual phenomena. You need to run, very vivid. Imagine in the movies where it goes blank and you hear a voice very clear saying something that is going to make the movie go darker in a different direction. So a change in the overall character of their auditory perception. Enhanced senses, a house looking more intense than all the ones around it. I almost died once. I thought I was dead, but then a light pulled me back and I woke up. It felt like God. Everything was blurry, not clear. It's like my brain couldn't understand what my eyes were seeing. Woman spoke to me and made all the other passengers' voices they kind of dissipate. Like I heard brightness, almost like a ringing, things like that. So, and we have, excuse me, jeez. We have some ordinary sensory quality, which you pretty much get the idea that you see the bird, that's your mom. Let's see, going to get a reading. Maybe a couple plants fell. So people tended to understand this item. Wonderful. We did the same thing for hearing. Oh, hearing voices was kind of, and we ended up getting more consistency than we expected. So if you hear a voice, you know it's not a real person talking to you. Is that ordinary? Is that non-ordinary? People, once we focused on the auditory quality of the experience, people tended to be, well, as reliable as we could possibly find here with our sample, in terms of if the voice sounded just like a normal voice, even though there wasn't a person there, they said, oh yeah, that's ordinary auditory quality. But if it had some bizarre, creepy quality, then it would be considered non-ordinary. I might have skipped that example. That was a fun one, or maybe not. Well, anyway, if it sounded, oh yeah, that like a voice, a distorted quality voice didn't sound normal, people would say non-ordinary, but normal voice hearing had an ordinary auditory quality, which is a distinction relevant to our psychosis researchers on the grant. So data here is not important, but a lot of people reported various types of cues, blah, blah, blah. Now we had this question from our original inventory: can science explain these, or is something more involved? And even among our nuns, very few people said science is going to be able to explain what happened to them. So these atheists, most of them, said no, we need something beyond. The William James is more to explain what's happening here, which is kind of cool, but maybe, I don't know if that's good news for the scientists trying to study this, but maybe we have more confidence being scientists ourselves. So we've got our items here. You know about those in general. And with these items, researchers can get detailed information about specific presence experiences and the sensory cues involved. You don't have to interview people. It's great. You probably get better quality data if you do interview people, but if you don't have time, you want to get as close to that as you can get these details, and we have the richness of interviews in our validation data turned into items. And again, modular, pick whatever experiences you want from the buffet table. Whether you want these pure senses, you're a purist like Barnby, and you say, the DHQ is the gold standard. You didn't see it, you didn't hear it, blah, blah, blah. You can do that. Or if you're Alderson Day, Brederoo study, you can say, oh yeah, we'll include all these sensory cues and count them all. And then you document and say, here's what happens when there are sensory cues, here's what happens when there aren't, instead of needing to look in the methods section and then the appendix and then follow the references to see what types of experiences people are talking about. So if this kind of approach gets adopted widely, then, and the modularity aspect is kind of cool. It doesn't work for all applications, but this will make it a lot easier to, even if people use terms in different ways, they'll be able to hash all that out, transcend the jingle fallacy, and get the, help the different papers talk to each other. Now, these don't capture every experience that might be of interest, but I think it's a good proof of concept showing that we can be a lot clearer about how to define and measure these experiences, clearer than the current literature. And that if we're not as clear as we could be, we can document, here's the areas of concern, here's what you might have to worry about or be cautious about. Don't overinterpret this particular difference between the US and India, because we know in India people are reporting more of these experiences, et cetera. Good to know the potential downsides of your items. And so we encourage other people to, if they don't want to use these, you're like, okay, that's a cool method, but these items aren't great, then you can make your own. Now you're equipped with those tools. And this is, again, it's not just a way to, let's make a questionnaire better, but it's going through this process really forces you to get a lot clearer about what you think you're measuring. and the validation can give clues about, there might be a concept that's not clear in your head that you don't realize until somebody asks, wait, do you mean this or that? And then you think, actually, I don't know. Maybe I mean both. Maybe I want to pick one. So my challenge to everyone using questionnaires is, do your participants understand your items as you intend? And how do you know? RPE could be used for that. So in general, we know about the RPE, get data from your population, revise things, document evidence of validity. It's hard to do, and developing this method in the context of such ineffable experiences was doubly challenging. If we had started with something else, it probably would have been easier. So doing this in the first place is tough, but man, it's a lot of work to even just figure out what you want to measure and then make sure it's going on, but can be really rewarding, even if just internally for your research team. And even if you just have a chance to run your item by 10 people, you might find that, oh yeah, this could totally be interpreted that way. You can fix it. That's nice. And of course, documenting it for others, what I like to emphasize. Let's see, another point I wanted to make, and I tie this in here. So I think in the workshop and in some of the discussions we had, one of the key things that if there's something we could have been clearer about, not just definitions, but the intended use of an instrument. So for example, that the question about, my family told me about this experience. Does that count as an experience or not? Well, if your goal is to, if your research question and your intended uses have to do with, how someone's memories affect them or what someone currently believes, then, whether they remember the experience or whether someone told it to them, it doesn't matter as much. They believe they had the experience. It might affect them in a certain way, so you would want to count that. But if you want to focus on the phenomenology of specific experiences, where people have to be able to remember the experience, then you would want to not count those people. So even the intended interpretation, it's not just a theoretical thing. It's always really try, if you're confused about should this count or not, what should the intended interpretation be, try to think of how am I going to use this questionnaire? What types of inferences am I going to try to make using this? And that can clear up a lot of these things that otherwise you just can't really find any solid ground to make a decision. So thinking about what exact applications you're going to have for the questionnaires is really helpful. That's probably something else in that measurement article by Flake and Freed. And again, I love the quantitative, as Donald Trump might say, but this can definitely stand to be supplemented with some qualitative evidence. So my final question, how likely are you to recommend RPE to a friend or colleague? So thank you. Sorry I had to rush through a little bit there. Yes, okay, great, thank you. Very likely, yes, all right, cool. Yeah. Okay, so I didn't leave a ton of time for questions probably, but do we have any quick ones here? Or? Understood as intended. Or, well, actually, sometimes it's a bad sign you don't get questions, usually. All right, thank you, everybody.